Jedediah Caldwell was riding home to die. He just didn't know it yet. The Dakota sun was bleeding out across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of rust and fire. Jed was 62 years old, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, and he was tired. Tired right down to the bone. 5 years since he'd buried his wife, Martha, and every day since had been a little quieter, a little emptier. He was just a rancher now, a ghost haunting the memory of a life he'd once lived. A life with a badge, a gun, and a purpose. That life was over, or so he thought. The first gunshot split the air like a whip crack. His horse, an old gray mare as weary as he was, screamed and reared. Jed's hand, gnarled with arthritis, shot to his hip, searching for the cold steel of a revolver that hadn't been there for a decade. The muscle memory was a cruel joke. A second shot echoed from just around the bend. And then a woman screamed. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated rage. Some instincts, Jed knew, never really die. He wasn't the law anymore. He was just an old man on a tired horse. But that scream woke something up inside him. He guided his horse off the road, into the whisper-quiet cover of the cottonwoods. He dismounted with the silence of a predator, his breath slow and steady, the breathing of a marksman. Peeking through the brush, he saw it. A stagecoach stopped dead. The driver was slumped over, a dark flower blooming on his chest. And two masked men were dragging a young woman out of the coach. She fought like a cornered wildcat, all fury and desperation. "Get your hands off me!" she yelled. One of the men laughed, a nasty grating sound. "You're worth more if you're not damaged," he sneered. And then he slapped her, hard. The sound was like another gunshot. Jed's world went red. 3 of them, all armed. He had nothing, no gun, no badge. Just his bare hands and a fire in his gut he thought had burned out years ago. The woman used the moment to claw her attacker's face, leaving bloody trails in the mask. The man howled and raised his pistol, not to threaten her, but to end her. Jed didn't think. He acted. He scooped up a rock, heavy and smooth, and threw it with a lifetime of practice behind the motion. It hit the gunman's hand with a sickening crack. The pistol fired harmlessly into the dirt. Before anyone could process what happened, Jed charged out of the trees like a force of nature, a man half his age. He slammed into the nearest bandit, his elbow finding the man's temple. They went down in a heap of dust and curses. The woman broke free and ran for the trees. But the third man, the leader, was smarter. He didn't panic. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The woman cried out, clutching her side, but she didn't stop. She stumbled into the cover of the woods. "Get her!" the leader roared. But Jed was already moving. He snatched the pistol from the fallen man's hand. The weight felt right. It felt like coming home. He fired a warning shot over their heads. "Back off," he said, his voice a low growl that carried the weight of 1,000 standoffs. The 2 remaining bandits froze. They saw it then. The way he stood, the way he held the gun, the look in his eyes. This was no ordinary rancher. "This ain't your business, old man," the leader snarled. "I just made it my business," Jed said. And in that moment, Jedediah Caldwell wasn't riding home to die anymore. He was riding into a war he didn't know he was about to start. The leader stared at Jed, his eyes narrowed behind the dirty cloth of his mask. He saw the truth in an instant. Jed wasn't just some rancher who got lucky. He was something else, something dangerous. The bandit Jed had knocked out was stirring, reaching for a knife hidden in his boot. Jed didn't even seem to look, but the barrel of his pistol shifted just enough. "Don't," he said. The word was cold enough to freeze blood. A tense standoff hung in the air, thick and heavy like the coming storm. The only sound was the woman's ragged breathing from somewhere deep in the trees. Finally, the leader made his choice. He gave a sharp nod to his partner. "We're leaving," he spat, his gaze locked on Jed. "But this ain't over. You just made a powerful enemy, old man." They scrambled onto their horses and galloped away, leaving their unconscious friend behind. Jed kept the pistol trained on them until they were nothing but a cloud of dust on the horizon. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. He turned toward the trees. "Miss, they're gone now. I'm here to help." A rustle of leaves and she emerged, one hand pressed hard against her side. Blood, dark and slick, seeped between her fingers. Her face was pale as a ghost, but her eyes were sharp, wary. "How do I know you're not with them?" she demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. Jed slowly, carefully, placed the pistol on the ground and raised his empty hands. "Name's Jedediah Caldwell. My ranch is just a few miles from here. I can get you to safety. Tend to that wound." She studied him, her mind clearly racing, weighing her options. She didn't have many. Finally, her shoulders slumped. "I don't have much choice, do I?" "There's always a choice," Jed said softly, "but I promise you, you'll be safe with me." Something in his gaze, a lifetime of honesty and hard-won integrity, must have convinced her. She gave a single, sharp nod, and then her eyes rolled back in her head. She swayed, about to collapse. Jed moved fast, catching her before she hit the ground. She felt impossibly light in his arms, as fragile as a bird. "I've got you," he murmured. "What's your name, miss?" "Abigail," she whispered, her breath ghosting against his cheek. "Abigail Warren." He helped her onto his horse, the storm finally breaking, the first fat drops of rain splattering in the dust around them. He mounted behind her, one arm holding her tight against him, feeling the warmth of her blood soak into his sleeve. As they rode toward Silverwood Ranch, a place that had been silent for 5 long years, Jed felt a flicker of a feeling he hadn't known since Martha's passing. It wasn't happiness. It was something far more dangerous. It was purpose. And he had a terrible feeling that this purpose, this girl, was going to get him killed. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had opened up. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the world to a gray, blurry mess. Jed practically carried Abigail inside, laying her gently on the old sofa by the cold stone fireplace. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on her face. She was younger than he'd thought, barely out of her teens. But her eyes, even clouded with pain, her eyes were old. They were the eyes of a soldier, constantly scanning, calculating. "Let me see that wound," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Her hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was like steel. "No." Jed froze, surprised by her strength. "Miss, I need to. I've got some medical experience." "I'll do it myself," she insisted, her teeth clenched. "Just bring me what I need." He saw the look on her face and knew better than to argue. He brought her clean cloths, bandages, and a bottle of whiskey. "For the pain," he said. She gave a weak, grim smile. "And disinfection." She didn't even hesitate. She poured the raw whiskey directly onto the wound, letting out a sharp, ragged hiss. Jed turned away, giving her privacy while he built a fire. He heard her sharp intakes of breath, the rustle of cloth. When he turned back, she was tying off the bandage with a knot that was tight and efficient. It was the knot of someone who had done this before. Many times. "You're good at that," he observed. "I was training to be a nurse," she said, her voice flat. "Before." She didn't explain what before meant. She just pulled her torn jacket close, suddenly looking small and vulnerable. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life." Jed just nodded, uncomfortable. He noticed her gaze was fixed on something across the room. She was staring at the wall, at a small, framed display he kept on the mantelpiece. The color drained from her face, leaving it a sickly white. In the frame was his old tarnished sheriff's badge. "You were a lawman," she breathed. It wasn't a question. "A long time ago," Jed said, watching her carefully. Her hand flew to her throat. "I have to go." "In this storm? With that wound? You'd be dead by morning." "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling with a terror that went far beyond the men on the road. "The man who's hunting me, he's a lawman, too." Jed's blood ran cold. This was no simple stagecoach robbery. This was something else entirely, something dark and twisted. "What's his name?" he asked. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, and spoke a name that meant nothing to Jed then, but would soon come to mean everything. Sebastian Voss. And just by hearing that name, Jed had stepped off a cliff. He just hadn't started falling yet. "He hunts people," Abigail whispered, her eyes darting toward the rain-lashed windows, as if Voss himself might materialize out of the storm. "Women, mostly," He says it's legal. He has papers, warrants. He calls us fugitives. Jed moved to the window, peering into the blackness. The story was wild, unbelievable, but the terror in her eyes was real. How did you end up on that stagecoach? I escaped, she said. 2 weeks ago. I've been running ever since. Those men on the road today, they were his. A chill went down Jed's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He never gives up, she added, her voice hollow. You're in danger just by having me here. Jed let the curtain fall. He looked at this young woman, wounded and terrified, and thought of Martha. His wife would have never turned her away. Lock the door behind me, he said, pulling on his coat. There's a shotgun under the sofa. My wife insisted on it. Don't open this door for anyone but me. He stepped out into the storm, but he wasn't just checking the perimeter. He was looking for something specific, something his old instincts were screaming at him about. He circled the house, the barn, the woodshed. The animals were quiet. Everything seemed normal, but as he came back around the front, near the edge of the property line, he saw it. Boot prints, in the mud, fresh ones, heading not toward the house, but away from it, toward the tree line. Someone hadn't just been here. Someone was here right now, watching, waiting. Jed's hand went to his empty hip. He was a sheep in a valley of wolves, and he'd just invited one inside. When he got back to the house, Abigail was sitting exactly where he'd left her, the heavy shotgun resting across her lap. Her knuckles were white. They're here, she whispered. Jed didn't have to ask how she knew. He just nodded grimly. Watching from the trees. At least 3 of them. Despair washed over her face. They found me. Miss Warren, Jed said, his voice steady and calm, a rock in her sea of fear. I need you to tell me everything. The full truth. Why are they so desperate to get you back? She looked up at him, the firelight dancing in her haunted eyes. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I'm just trouble. Jed walked over to the mantelpiece and took down a small, silver-framed photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. This was Martha, he said. My wife. She used to say it was our duty to help folks in trouble. He put the photo back. Now, the truth. Abigail took a deep breath, and the story that poured out of her was a nightmare. She'd been taken from St. Louis months ago, drugged and thrown in a wagon with other women. They were taken to a remote compound, a prison hidden in the wilderness. Voss was the warden. He broke them, conditioned them, turned them into possessions. He runs a business, she said, her voice hardening with rage. He sells women to mining camps, to lonely ranchers, to anyone with enough money. He creates fake documents, bounty notices. He makes it all look legal. The law looks the other way because half of them are on his payroll. How did you get out? Jed asked. A flicker of pride crossed her face. I have an eidetic memory. I remember everything I see perfectly. I memorized the guards' routines, the layout of the compound. I picked the lock on my door with a piece of wire I'd worked loose from my bed. She had run for days, a ghost in the wilderness, before finding a kind soul who gave her money for the stagecoach. A stagecoach that was supposed to take her to safety. You believe me? She asked, her voice small. I do, Jed said. And in that moment he realized something. The boot prints outside weren't from Voss's men. They were too small, the stride too short. They were Abigail's boot prints, from when she arrived. The men in the woods weren't watching the house because they had tracked her here. They had been waiting for her all along. The stagecoach attack wasn't a coincidence. It was a trap, and he had walked right into the middle of it. The realization hit Jed like a physical blow. This wasn't a random encounter. The attack, his rescue of Abigail, it was all a setup, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater designed to get her inside his house. But why? Why go to all this trouble? Just as the first pale hint of dawn was breaking the horizon, he got his answer. The sound of horses. Not just a few, a lot of them. Jed was instantly on his feet. Abigail sat bolt upright on the sofa, her face a mask of terror. Stay inside, Jed commanded, moving to the window. 5 riders were approaching, moving with the confidence of men who owned the ground they rode on. They were led by a tall man in a long black duster coat. Even at a distance, there was an aura of absolute authority about him. "Voss," Abigail whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. Jed's hand once again went to his empty hip. He felt naked, vulnerable. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell." The voice that called out was not the voice of a backwoods thug. It was cultured, pleasant, and utterly chilling. "Might we have a word?" Jed glanced back at Abigail. "Get the shotgun. Stay out of sight." He stepped onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. The man in the black duster smiled. It was a predator's smile, all teeth and no warmth. He was younger than Jed expected, with sharp, intelligent features and eyes as pale and cold as a winter sky. "This is private property," Jed said, his voice flat. "Indeed it is," Voss replied smoothly. "Silverwood Ranch, owned by Jedediah Caldwell, former sheriff of Redemption, decorated sharpshooter before that. I do my homework, Mr. Caldwell." The casual way he listed the facts of Jed's life was more threatening than any drawn gun. "I'm looking for a fugitive," Voss continued, producing a document from his coat. "Abigail Warren, wanted for murder in Missouri." Jed kept his face a blank mask. "Haven't seen her." Voss's smile thinned. "That's odd. My men tracked her directly to this property." He then gestured to one of the riders, a man Jed hadn't paid much attention to. The man nudged his horse forward. As he got closer, the morning light hit his face, and Jed's heart stopped. It was Maxwell Bennett, the current sheriff of Redemption, the young deputy Jed had trained himself, the man he had handpicked to take his place. "Morning, Jed," Bennett said, his eyes refusing to meet Jed's. "What is this, Max?" Jed demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Just doing my job, Jed," Bennett mumbled, staring at his saddle horn. "The law's the law." "Sheriff Bennett has been most helpful," Voss interjected, his voice dripping with condescension. "In fact, he was the one who suggested this little arrangement. He told me all about you, about your strict moral code, about how you'd never turn away a woman in distress." The trap snapped shut. It wasn't just about getting Abigail. It was about him. They had used his own decency, his own past, as a weapon against him. "I know you haven't touched a gun in 10 years, Caldwell," Voss said, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate. "Not since the incident with the bank robber. Timothy, a young man, barely 19. Jed felt the blood drain from his face. "Timothy Voss," the man continued, his smile returning, colder than ever. "My little brother. You killed my brother, Mr. Caldwell. And now you're going to give me my fugitive. Or I'm going to burn this ranch to the ground with you and her inside it." It wasn't about the law. It was never about the law. It was about revenge. And Jed had just realized he was completely, utterly trapped. The world seemed to tilt under Jed's feet. Sebastian Voss wasn't just a slaver. He was the brother of the boy Jed had killed a decade ago. The shooting that had ended his career and shattered his soul. It wasn't a random bank robbery. It was all connected. A spider's web of revenge, and he was the fly caught dead center. "He had a gun to a teller's head," Jed said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Voss waved a dismissive hand. "Details. The point is, I know who you are, and I strongly suggest you don't make this any more difficult than it needs to be." He gestured toward the house. "Now where is she?" Jed stood on that porch, a ghost from the past, facing a nightmare he never could have imagined. 5 armed men, his own protege, Bennett, standing against him, and a personal vendetta aimed right at his heart. "You have 30 seconds to produce the girl," Voss said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "Or my men are coming in." The door behind Jed creaked open. Abigail stepped out onto the porch. She held the shotgun, and her hands weren't shaking. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "I'm right here," she said, her voice clear and strong. "No need to threaten an innocent man." A slow, satisfied smile spread across Voss's face. "Miss Warren, how good of you to join us." Jed moved to stand in front of her. "Go back inside." "It's over, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, her eyes locked on his. "I won't have your blood on my hands." "Listen to the lady," Voss mocked. Abigail stepped past Jed, moving to the edge of the porch. "I'll go with you," she said, her gaze fixed on Voss. "On one condition." Voss raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. You're not in a position to make demands. One condition, she repeated. You leave him alone. He had nothing to do with this. Voss pretended to consider it. Very well. You have my word. He gestured with his pistol, dropped the shotgun. Abigail carefully set the weapon down on the porch floor and walked down the steps. One of Voss's men dismounted and roughly tied her hands. She didn't flinch. She just kept her eyes on Jed, and in them he saw not defeat, but a silent, desperate plea. Max, you know this is wrong, Jed called out to Bennett, his last desperate hope. Bennett just stared at the ground, his face a mask of shame. Voss turned back to Jed, a look of pity on his face. The world is changing, Caldwell. In this new world, everything has a price, even people. He gave the order, and his men started to move, taking Abigail with them. Something inside Jed, something that had been dormant for 10 long years, finally snapped. He lunged for the shotgun on the porch. Jed, no! Bennett yelled. Voss was faster. His pistol was out and fired in a single fluid motion. The shot was a thunderclap in the morning air. The bullet screamed past Jed's ear, close enough for him to feel its heat, and splintered the wood of the porch railing right next to his head. He froze, his hand inches from the gun. That was a warning, Voss said, his voice deadly calm. I gave my word no harm would come to you. Don't make me a liar. Slowly, painfully, Jed straightened up. He was defeated, utterly and completely. As they rode away, Abigail looked back at him one last time. Her face was a storm of emotions. But then she did something strange. Her expression changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. She gave the slightest of nods. It wasn't a nod of farewell. It was a nod of instruction. And her eyes weren't looking at him. They were looking at the ground, right next to the porch steps where she had stood. Jed watched them disappear over the rise, the full weight of his failure crashing down on him. He had lost, but as he turned to go back inside his empty house, his gaze fell on the spot Abigail had looked at. There, half hidden in the dirt, was a small, folded piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. He picked it up. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. It was a note written in a hurried, precise hand. It said, Blackwater Creek, warehouse. Tonight. They're selling us. He has your wife's journal. Jed's blood turned to ice. Martha's journal, the one she'd kept for years, the one he thought he'd burned after her death. How did Voss have it? And what did it have to do with any of this? The note wasn't a plea for help. It was a map. It was a weapon. Abigail hadn't surrendered. She had just given him his marching orders. Jed stormed back into the house, his mind reeling. Martha's journal. The words echoed in his head, a ghost from a past he had misunderstood completely. He went straight to his bedroom, to the loose floorboard under the old rug. He pried it up. The dusty wooden box was still there, the key still on a chain around his neck. His fingers, clumsy with rage and adrenaline, fumbled with the lock. He threw the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn velvet, lay his Colt .45 revolver and his old sheriff's badge. He lifted the gun. The weight was a familiar comfort, a terrible promise. This was the gun that had killed Timothy Voss, the gun he had sworn never to touch again. Some promises, he now realized, were made to be broken. He strapped on the gun belt. It felt alien and natural all at once. Then he did something he hadn't done in 10 years. He pinned the tarnished silver star back on his chest. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He wasn't just a man seeking revenge. He was the law, and he was coming for Sebastian Voss. His first stop was the one place in redemption where secrets went to die, the law office of Luther Coleman. The old lawyer was ancient, a stooped relic hunched over a desk piled high with yellowed paper. He looked up as Jed entered, his eyes widening behind his thick spectacles. Jedediah Caldwell, he rasped. Twice in 1 decade. Must be a record. Jed didn't waste time with pleasantries. He put Abigail's note on the desk. Blackwater Creek. My wife's journal. Sebastian Voss. Talk. Luther's face went pale. He got up, shuffled to the window and pulled down the shade. Where did you hear that name? He whispered. He took a girl from my ranch this morning. Oh, Jed, the old man sighed, sinking into his chair. You've stepped into the hornet's nest now. Tell me, Jed demanded. Voss is a modern-day slave trader, Luther said, his voice barely audible. He has powerful friends, judges, marshals, even the territorial governor, they say. Jed's jaw tightened. My wife's journal. What does he want with it? Luther hesitated, his eyes full of a pity that Jed didn't understand. Jed, what I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear. He leaned forward, his old hands trembling. Martha. Martha wasn't just a rancher's wife. She was running her own operation, an underground railroad. She was helping Voss's victims escape. The room spun. Jed gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. No, she would have told me. Would she? Luther asked gently. A man like you, a sheriff who lived and died by the letter of the law? She knew you'd go after Voss with your badge and your gun, and she knew it would get you killed. She was protecting you, Jed. The truth was a punch to the gut. His wife, his quiet, gentle Martha, had been a secret warrior, and he had been blind. Her heart, Jed stammered. The doctor said her heart just gave out. Hearts can be made to give out, Luther said grimly. Certain poisons. They leave no trace. They mimic the symptoms perfectly. The floor fell away. Martha hadn't died. She had been murdered, and Voss had done it. The journal, Jed said, his voice a dead thing. It wasn't just a diary, was it? No, Luther said, shaking his head. It was his ledger. One of the girls she helped had been his bookkeeper. She copied everything. Names, dates, bribes paid to officials all over the territory. Your wife was building a case, Jed. A case that would have brought down Voss and all his powerful friends. That journal is the proof. It all clicked into place. Her death. The sudden appearance of Timothy Voss in redemption. The bank robbery that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was all a setup. Voss had murdered his wife, then sent his own brother to die, all to destroy Jed, to punish him for Martha's interference. He thought he had taken everything from him. He was wrong. Jed now had something he hadn't had in years, a reason to live and a reason to kill. He's having an auction tonight, Jed said, his voice flat and hard as iron. At the old railroad warehouse. He's selling Abigail. You can't go there alone, Luther pleaded. He'll have a small army. Jed turned to leave, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. He can have the whole damn army, he said, his eyes burning with a cold fire. I'm coming for my wife's journal, and I'm going to burn his entire world to the ground. Jed left Luther's office and walked straight to the livery stable. The air smelled of hay and manure, a scent of simple, honest work that felt like it belonged to another man's life. Need your strongest horse, Edwin? Jed told the stable master. And your fastest. Edwin Porter, a man whose face was as weathered as old leather, raised a bushy eyebrow. Going somewhere in a hurry, Jed? You could say that. Jed paid for the horse, a powerful black gelding named Thunder, and then his eyes fell on a Winchester rifle hanging on the stable wall. That for sale? Belongs to a fella who left it as collateral, Edwin said. Reckon he won't be back for it. 10 minutes later, Jed rode out of redemption. He wasn't the tired old rancher who had ridden in. He was an instrument of vengeance, armed with a Colt, a Winchester, and a heart full of cold, righteous fury. He avoided the main road, cutting through the wild country he knew like the back of his hand. He knew the old railroad warehouse at Blackwater Creek. He'd cleared vagrants out of it more than once back in his day. A big skeletal structure, isolated and forgotten, the perfect place for monsters to do their work. As he rode, the setting sun painted the sky in bloody streaks of orange and red. His mind, sharp and clear for the first time in years, was working, planning. This wasn't a lawman's raid. This was a soldier's mission. One man against an unknown number of hostiles. The odds were suicidal. He didn't care. He dismounted a mile from the warehouse, tethering Thunder in a deep ravine where he wouldn't be seen. From here on, he was a ghost. He moved through the twilight with the practiced silence of a hunter, the Winchester feeling like an extension of his arm. He crested a small rise and saw it. The warehouse, a dark silhouette against the dying light. Lanterns glowed from within. Horses were tethered outside. And guards. He counted 4, then 5, patrolling the perimeter. A frontal assault was impossible. He needed another way in. Jed circled the property, keeping to the shadows, his eyes taking in every detail. The north side of the building was pushed up against a steep, crumbling embankment, and near the top, almost hidden in the darkness, was a small window. A window that led to the loft. It was a risky climb, but it was his only chance. He slung the rifle over his back and started up the slope, his fingers and boots searching for purchase in the loose rock and dirt. A few pebbles skittered down, and he froze, listening. Nothing. He kept climbing, his muscles screaming in protest. At the top, he peered through the grimy glass. What he saw below stole the breath from his lungs. The warehouse floor was set up like a grotesque parody of a livestock auction. Rows of chairs were filled with well-dressed men, their faces eager and predatory. On a raised platform at the front, a line of women stood, their wrists bound, their eyes empty and dead. Abigail was among them, but her eyes weren't empty. They were scanning the room, defiant and searching. Sebastian Voss stood beside them, preening like a showman, his voice echoing in the vast space. A fine selection tonight, gentlemen. Healthy, obedient, and eager to please. To one side of the platform, sitting in a large ornate chair like a king on his throne, was another man. A man Jed recognized instantly from court appearances and wanted posters. Judge Harrison, the most powerful circuit court judge in the territory. The law itself wasn't just blind, it was complicit. It was running the whole damn show. Jed felt a rage so pure, so absolute, it nearly choked him. He took the handle of his knife and carefully, quietly, began to pry open the old sealed window. The faint sound of wood groaning was lost in the noise from below. He slipped inside, a shadow in the dusty, cobweb-filled loft. A guard was patrolling a catwalk just below him. Jed timed his movements to the man's footsteps. When the guard passed underneath, Jed dropped. He landed silently, his arm wrapping around the man's throat, cutting off his shout. The guard went limp. Jed dragged him into the shadows, took his pistol, and bound him with his own belt. He was armed. He was inside. The auction had begun. Voss was presenting the first woman, a terrified girl who couldn't have been more than 16. The bidding started. Jed's stomach turned. He couldn't save them all, not with a frontal assault. He needed chaos. He needed a distraction. His eyes scanned the loft. It was filled with old, dry timber, discarded crates, and piles of oil-soaked rags. It was a tinderbox. He moved to the far end of the loft, away from the main floor. He gathered a pile of rags and scraps of wood. He took out the small box of matches from his pocket. He struck one. The tiny flame flickered to life, a small beacon of destruction in the darkness. He touched it to the oil-soaked rags. They erupted. "Fire!" someone below screamed. Pandemonium. The buyers scrambled for the exits. Voss's men were shouting, confused, trying to control the women in the crowd. In the smoke and chaos, Jed scrambled down a ladder to the main floor. He saw Abigail and the other women being herded toward a side door by two guards. This was his chance. He moved through the swirling smoke like a phantom. One of the guards was coughing, his eyes watering. Jed stepped out of the shadows and brought the butt of his Winchester down on the back of the other guard's head. The man dropped like a stone. The first guard spun around, reaching for his gun, but he was staring down the barrel of Jed's Colt. "Keys," Jed said. "Now." He freed Abigail first, then handed her the keys. "Get the others. Go out that side door and run. Follow the creek downstream." "What about you?" she asked, her eyes wide in the flickering firelight. "I have unfinished business," Jed said, his gaze fixed on the office at the back of the warehouse, where he had last seen Voss and Judge Harrison. "Go!" The women scrambled out into the night. Just as Abigail was about to follow, Voss's voice boomed through the smoke. "Caldwell, I know you're here. You won't leave this building alive." The fire was spreading, the roar of the flames growing louder. The whole building was groaning, ready to collapse. Jed pushed Abigail toward the door. "Get out of here!" "Not without you!" she yelled back over the roar. Before he could argue, a section of the roof collapsed, sending a shower of burning embers down between them, cutting them off from each other. "Jed!" she screamed. He could see her silhouette through the flames, her face a mask of terror. "Go!" he roared back. "Live!" He turned and walked back into the inferno, his Colt in one hand, the captured guard's pistol in the other. He was no longer just a man. He was a reckoning, and he was ready to drag Sebastian Voss and his entire corrupt world straight to hell with him. The warehouse was an inferno. The heat was a physical thing, pressing in on Jed from all sides, sucking the air from his lungs. Smoke burned his eyes, turning the world into a nightmare of dancing shadows and glowing embers. "You're a fool, Caldwell," Voss's voice echoed through the chaos, disembodied and mocking. "You could have walked away. Now you'll die for nothing." Jed crouched behind a stack of burning crates, peering through the haze. He saw Voss near the auction platform, flanked by two of his men. They were searching for him, their pistols out. "It's over, Voss," Jed yelled back. "The women are gone." "Insignificant," Voss screamed, his composure finally cracking. "I can get more. But you took something from me. You took my brother, and you took my property." Jed saw his opening. He raised both pistols and fired, a thunderous volley that sent the two henchmen diving for cover. One of them cried out, clutching his arm. In the confusion, Jed moved, sprinting from one piece of cover to the next, a ghost in the swirling smoke. This was his element, the chaos of battle. A burning beam crashed down from the ceiling, narrowly missing him. The entire structure was shaking, groaning its death rattle. Time was running out. He spotted Voss again, trying to rally his men. Jed raised his Colt, the sights centering perfectly on Voss's chest. This was it. Justice for Martha, for Abigail, for all of them. His finger tightened on the trigger, but then a new voice cut through the roar of the fire. "Drop it, Voss, it's over." Sheriff Maxwell Bennett stepped out of the smoke near the back office, his own pistol leveled at Voss. His face was grim, determined. He'd chosen a side. Voss just laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "Bennett, my loyal dog. Did you finally grow a spine?" "I said drop it," Bennett repeated. For a split second, Voss seemed to comply. He lowered his gun slightly. Then with lightning speed, he spun and fired at Bennett. Bennett staggered back, clutching his shoulder, a look of shocked betrayal on his face. In that same instant, Jed fired. His bullet hit Voss in the leg, just as he'd intended. A crippling shot, not a killing one. He wouldn't become a murderer again. Voss screamed in pain and dropped to one knee, but he wasn't finished. He raised his pistol, taking aim at the wounded Bennett, ready to finish him off. Jed didn't have time to think. He fired again. The bullet struck Sebastian Voss square in the chest. The man who had haunted his life for 10 years jerked backward, his eyes wide with surprise. The gun fell from his hand, and he collapsed to the floor, consumed by the smoke and flames. The warehouse screamed its final warning. "We have to go," Jed yelled, rushing to Bennett's side. He hauled the younger man to his feet, supporting him as they stumbled toward the nearest exit. The roof was collapsing behind them, the world dissolving into a hellscape of fire and splintering wood. They burst out into the night air just as the entire building imploded, sending a massive plume of fire and sparks into the sky like a volcano. Jed dragged Bennett down the embankment toward the creek. They collapsed by the water's edge, gasping for breath, the heat of the fire on their backs. "Voss!" Bennett gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "He's gone," Jed said. "But the office, the documents, the proof against Harrison. They're gone too," Jed said grimly. They had won the battle, but they might have just lost the war. Without that proof, Judge Harrison was untouchable. Suddenly, they heard the sound of horses. Jed scrambled for his rifle, but Bennett grabbed his arm. "Wait," he said. "It's them." A group of riders emerged from the darkness. They wore the badges of U.S. Marshals. Leading them was a tall, grim-faced man with a silver star on his chest. "Bennett," the marshal said, his eyes taking in the scene. "What in God's name happened?" "It's a long story, Marshal Lawrence," Bennett said. But before he could continue, another figure stepped out from behind the marshals. It was Abigail. Her face was smudged with soot. Her dress was torn, but she was alive. And she wasn't alone. She held a thick, leather-bound book in her hands. The firelight from the burning warehouse glinted off the familiar gold-leaf lettering on the cover. M.C. Martha Caldwell. "I went back," Abigail said, her voice shaking but strong. "Voss's office. The floor had given way. I saw the safe. It had fallen through to the ground floor. The fire hadn't reached it yet." She held out the journal to Jed, his wife's legacy, the weapon she had died to create. They hadn't lost the proof. They had just found it. Marshal Lawrence took the journal, his eyes widening as he flipped through the pages. "My God," he whispered. This is everything. Names, dates. It's all here." He looked from the journal to Jed, then to Bennett. "But this is just Voss. The man pulling the strings is Judge Harrison. He's already fled." Abigail stepped forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the hardened marshal take a step back. "He hasn't fled," she said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I know where he's going. I know where he lives." The marshal looked at her, confused. "How could you possibly know that?" Abigail took a deep breath, and the secret she had carried, the final devastating piece of the puzzle, came out. "Because Judge Harrison," she said, her voice breaking with a mixture of shame and fury, "is my father." The silence that followed Abigail's bombshell was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. Jed stared at her, then at Bennett, who gave a slow, confirming nod. The marshal, Lawrence, looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Your father?" Abigail's face was a mask of pain. "He found out I knew about his business. He told me I was a disappointment, just like my mother, so he sold me to Voss. As a punishment." The sheer, monstrous cruelty of it was beyond comprehension. This wasn't just about greed or power. It was about a depravity so profound it defied reason. "When the fire started, I heard him tell his driver," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "Fort Collins. He has a house there, under a different name. He thinks no one knows about it." Lawrence snapped back to action. "Saddle up," he barked at his men. "We ride for Fort Collins. Now!" He turned to Bennett. "You need a doctor. I'm leaving 2 men to escort you back to town." "I'm coming with you," Bennett protested, trying to stand. Lawrence pushed him gently back down. "You've done your part, Sheriff. Let us finish it." The marshal then turned his hard gaze on Jed. "Caldwell, this is federal business now." "That journal belonged to my wife," Jed said, his voice low and steady. "Harrison had her murdered. This isn't just federal business. It's my business." Lawrence studied him for a long moment, seeing the unyielding resolve in the old lawman's eyes. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Get the journal. Be ready to ride in 5 minutes." Jed retrieved the precious book from Abigail. He looked at her, this young woman who had endured hell and come back fighting. "You should go back to redemption," he said gently. "You're safe now." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not safe. None of us are, until he's in chains. I have to be there. I have to see it." Jed didn't argue. He understood. This was her fight as much as it was his. The ride to Fort Collins was a desperate, punishing race against time. They rode through the night, pushing their horses to the brink, the fate of the territory hanging in the balance. They arrived just as the sun was beginning to touch the horizon, painting the eastern sky in soft pastels. The town was peaceful, asleep. Abigail directed them to an immaculate house on the edge of town, the kind of place a respectable, wealthy man would own. Lawrence positioned his men, surrounding the property in a silent, professional cordon. Then he, Jed, and Abigail approached the front door. Lawrence raised his hand to knock, but before his knuckles could touch the wood, the door swung open. Judge Harrison stood there. He was fully dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He held a cup of coffee in one hand. He looked completely calm, completely unconcerned. "Marshal Lawrence," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was beginning to wonder when you'd arrive." He made no move to resist. He simply set down his coffee cup and held out his wrist to be cuffed, as if this were all just a minor, tedious formality. His composure was absolute. It was only as the marshals were leading him away that he saw Abigail. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face. Not anger, not remorse. Surprise. "Abigail," he said, his voice flat. "So you are the source of all this trouble." I chose to stand for what's right, Father, she replied, her voice steady. A foolish choice, he said dismissively. His gaze then shifted to Jed. And you must be the husband. Martha was a sentimental fool. She should have stayed out of matters that didn't concern her. The casual, callous way he spoke her name sent a surge of white-hot rage through Jed. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to his Colt. He's not worth it, Caldwell, Lawrence warned, stepping between them. Harrison actually smiled, a thin, bloodless smile. Listen to the marshal. Violence solves nothing. Rich words from a man who sells human beings, Jed snarled. Commerce, Harrison corrected him. The oldest business in the world, and a profitable one. You think this changes anything? You have my ledger, perhaps. You'll put me in a comfortable prison for a few years. But my associates, my partners, they are everywhere. The organization will continue. You haven't won. You've merely annoyed us. His arrogance was breathtaking. Even in chains, he believed he was invincible. You'll hang, Jed promised. I highly doubt it, Harrison said with a chilling certainty. As they loaded him into a prison wagon, Abigail moved to Jed's side. He's wrong, she whispered. I know he's wrong. I hope you're right, Jed said, watching the wagon roll away. The sun was fully up now, a new day dawning. They had done it. They had cut the head off the snake. But as Jed looked at the peaceful town around them, he couldn't shake the judge's final words. You haven't won. You've merely annoyed us. He had a sickening feeling that this was far from over. The journey back to redemption was quiet. The urgency was gone, replaced by a heavy exhaustion and the gnawing uncertainty of what came next. Jed and Abigail rode side by side, the silence between them comfortable, forged in the fires they had just walked through together. Do you think he'll really get away with it? Abigail asked as they made camp for the night, the small fire pushing back the vast darkness of the prairie. Men like your father, Jed said, staring into the flames. They have deep roots. You cut down the tree, but the roots remain. They can always grow back. So we keep cutting, she said, her voice filled with a determination that both impressed and worried him. When they rode into redemption the next day, it was to chaos. A crowd was gathered in the main street, centered around the telegraph office. People were shouting, their faces a mixture of fear and anger. Jonas, the telegraph operator, saw Jed and ran toward them. Jed, thank God! A telegram just came through from the Capitol. What is it? Jed asked, already dreading the answer. Judge Harrison. He's been released. The words hung in the air, a death sentence to all their hopes. On his own recognizance, Jonas stammered. The territorial governor intervened personally. He's launching an independent investigation. Harrison is free. The crowd surged around Jed, demanding answers. They had heard the rumors, the whispers about what happened at Blackwater Creek. Now they were looking to him, the old sheriff, their sheriff. What does this mean, Jed? Someone shouted. Jed looked at the faces of his neighbors, good, hard-working people. He saw their fear, and he knew he couldn't let it stand. He swung himself up onto the boardwalk railing, holding up his hands for silence. It means the system we trusted has failed us, he called out, his voice ringing with an authority he hadn't used in a decade. It means the corruption goes all the way to the top. Judge Harrison runs a slave trade. My wife died trying to stop him, and our governor has set him free. A roar of outrage went up from the crowd. So what do? Yelled a rancher. We can't fight the governor. We don't have to, Jed countered. We can make a stand right here. We can make redemption a place where men like Harrison have no power. We organize, we arm ourselves, and we send a message to the whole damn territory that we will not be broken. A cheer went up. Hope, fierce and defiant, replaced the fear in their eyes. They had a leader again. Later at the doctor's office, he told a furious Sheriff Bennett what had happened. They're coming for us, Jed, Bennett said from his sickbed. Harrison won't let this stand. He'll make an example of this town. I know, Jed said. That's why you need to get better. In the meantime. He looked at the badge Bennett kept on his bedside table. The town needs a sheriff. Then you have to do it, Bennett said. Deputize me, officially. Jed picked up the silver star. It felt heavier than ever. He pinned it to his chest. As he and Abigail walked out into the street, where the men of the town were already forming patrols, she looked at him. "Acting Sheriff Caldwell," she said, a small smile on her face. "It suits you." Just then, Jonas came running out of the telegraph office again, his face white as a sheet. "Jed, another message. It's from my source at the Capitol." "What is it?" "It's Harrison. He's not waiting for an investigation. He's gathered a small army of hired guns. At least a dozen men, maybe more. They're riding for redemption. Now." The blood drained from Abigail's face. "He's coming to wipe us off the map." "How long do we have?" Jed asked, his mind already calculating. "They could be here by tomorrow," Jonas said, his voice trembling. "They'll be at Cypress Ridge by dawn." A plan, desperate and suicidal, formed in Jed's mind. "Get the women and children to the church," he ordered Jonas. "Barricade the streets. Any man who can hold a gun meets me at the sheriff's office in 1 hour." "What are you going to do?" Abigail asked, grabbing his arm. "I'm not letting him turn this town into a battlefield," Jed said, his face set like stone. "I'm going to meet him at the ridge, alone." "That's suicide," she cried. "He'll kill you before you get within 100 yards. "Maybe," Jed said, pulling his arm free. "But it's the only way to buy this town time. It's the only way to protect these people." He looked at her, his eyes full of a grim finality. "This is my fight, Abigail. This is where it ends." He turned and walked toward the stable, leaving her standing in the dust of the main street. He was no longer just a man, or even a sheriff. He was a sacrifice, and he was riding out to meet an army, with nothing but a badge, a gun, and a promise he had made to his dead wife. He would not let her have died in vain. Dawn at Cypress Ridge was a cold, cruel affair. A thin mist clung to the ground, and the air was sharp with the scent of pine and impending violence. Jed stood beside his horse, hidden in a thicket of trees overlooking the narrow pass. He was one man, an old man at that, and somewhere on the other side of that ridge, an army of killers was riding toward him. He checked his Winchester one last time. He had his Colt on his hip and a second pistol tucked into his belt. He had all the ammunition he'd been able to carry. It wouldn't be enough. This wasn't a fight he could win. It was a stand he had to make. He could hear them now, the distant thunder of hooves growing steadily louder. He peered through the trees. It was Harrison's army. A dozen riders, maybe more, all of them hard-faced men who killed for a living. And at their head, riding a pristine white stallion, was Judge Harrison himself, dressed not as a lawman, but as a warlord. They entered the pass, a column of death moving with arrogant certainty. Jed raised the Winchester to his shoulder. He could take out Harrison right now. One shot, end it. But killing from the shadows wasn't his way. It wasn't justice. It was just another murder. He stepped out from the trees into the middle of the road. He stood there, a lone figure against the rising sun, the silver star on his chest glinting in the pale light. The column of riders slowed, then stopped. A murmur of confusion ran through them. Judge Harrison urged his horse forward, a look of amused disbelief on his face. "Caldwell," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Have you lost your mind, or have you simply come to surrender?" "I'm the acting sheriff of Redemption, Harrison." Jed's voice boomed, clear and steady, echoing off the canyon walls. "And I have a warrant for your arrest, for murder, kidnapping, and treason against the people of this territory." Harrison actually laughed. He threw his head back and laughed, a sound of pure, arrogant contempt. "A warrant? You are a pathetic relic, Caldwell. Your time is over. The law is what I say it is. Now get out of my way, or I will have my men ride you down." "You want redemption, you have to come through me," Jed said. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stood his ground. Harrison's smile faded. His eyes turned cold as ice. "So be it," he said softly. "Kill him." The hired guns raised their rifles. This was it, the end of the line. Jed closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, a picture of Martha's smile flashing in his mind. He was ready. Then a new sound, a single, clear bugle call from the ridge above them. Harrison and his men looked up, confused. Jed looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. Lining the ridge on both sides of the pass were dozens of men. Ranchers, farmers, the shopkeepers of Redemption. They held rifles, shotguns, old hunting muskets. And at their center, sitting on a horse with a rifle across his lap, was Sheriff Maxwell Bennett, his arm in a sling, his face pale but resolute. Beside him was Abigail, and she wasn't holding a rifle. She was holding a lit stick of dynamite. "It seems you're the one who's outnumbered, Judge," Bennett yelled down. Harrison stared, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. He had been so certain of his power, of his invincibility. "This changes nothing," he shrieked. "Fire! Kill them all!" But his men hesitated. They were killers, but they weren't suicidal. They were surrounded, outgunned, with a crazy woman holding dynamite above their heads. "It's over, Harrison," Jed said, finally raising his Winchester. "There's nowhere left to run." For a moment, Harrison looked like a cornered animal. Then his face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. He drew his own ornate pistol, not aiming at the men on the ridge, but at Jed. He was going to take his nemesis with him. He fired, but Jed was faster. His rifle cracked a fraction of a second sooner. Judge Harrison was thrown from his saddle, a neat dark hole appearing in the center of his chest. He hit the ground and didn't move. A stunned silence fell over the pass. The hired guns looked at their dead employer, then at the dozens of rifles aimed at them from the ridge. One by one, they dropped their weapons. It was over. The battle for redemption was won. Weeks later, the town was still healing. Federal marshals, prompted by Luther Coleman's letters and the undeniable proof of Harrison's private war, had swept through the territory, arresting dozens of corrupt officials named in Martha's journal. The system was finally cleaning itself out. Jed stood on the porch of his ranch, watching the sunset. He wasn't wearing the badge anymore. He'd given it back to Bennett the day he was cleared for duty. He was just a rancher again. But he wasn't the same man. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said from beside him. Abigail had moved into the spare room at the ranch, helping him fix the place up while she waited for her nursing application to be approved by the town council, which, given the circumstances, was a mere formality. "It is," Jed said. "Martha loved this view." "She would be proud of you," Abigail said softly. "Of what you did." Jed was quiet for a moment. "I just finished what she started." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to purple. The ghosts of the past were finally at rest. The future, for the first time in a very long time, felt like a possibility. Jedediah Caldwell had ridden out looking for a place to die. Instead, he had found a reason to live. He had found his own redemption. And that's the story of how one old lawman, a brave young woman in a town full of ordinary people, stood up to a corrupt empire and won. It just goes to show you that a single spark of courage can burn down even the darkest of forests. If you enjoyed the story and you want to hear more tales of justice from the Old West, do me a favor and hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe, because the story I've got for you next week, well, let's just say it makes this one look like a walk in the park. You won't want to miss it.